In the previous video, we discussed how to process the financial statements and calculate the ratios we need for pro forma model. Now let's take those results and actually build our model. Okay, let's go back to our ratios. Here, in this spreadsheet, you should have all the ratios calculated. So I'm going to copy and paste. Again, I just need the numbers, so I'll just paste the numbers here. And also, I'm going to copy and paste these items here, because we're going to forecast the income and the balance sheet. So we're going to forecast these numbers. And the years. So because we're doing this forecast at the end of 2011, so we're forecasting 2012, 2013, and so forth. So the most recent year would be 2011, right? I'm going to copy these. So this would be the year 0 in our chapter 5 template. So I think I'm going to copy the numbers again. Okay. So that's the year. Highlight that. Make some small changes because for debt I don't need to worry about each component, so I only worry about the total debt. So I'm going to remove these components. Okay, I think other things should be in order now. Alright, so we're forecasting 2012, 2013. So let's do the next 5 years, the way to 2016. Okay. And later to do the valuation, we also need the long-term growth rate in free cash flow, and also we're going to need a WACC. So for the WACC of Caterpillar, we have a spreadsheet called Caterpillar WACC. It's on Canvas, right? So you can see there our estimate of WACC is about 13% per year. Okay. Later I might be able to make another video to probably explain how we got there, but you can take a look at the answer on Canvas. So I'm going to take this number now for now. The long-term growth rate, let's make, again, this is our assumption, so let's make some assumption here. Later, again, we're going to do we can do some sensitivity analysis. Right? Okay, before I forecast these future values, I want to kind of change because remember here for all the costs, I still have positive numbers, right? So for now, I kind of want to change them back to negative numbers, so it's more consistent with our convention in chapter 5, right? So when we calculate these totals, we can just sum the numbers up. Okay. So let me change all the costs to negative numbers first. So that's a cost. That's a cost. Tax is a cost. Dividend is a cost. Okay. So now these numbers are all, the costs are all negative. So let's go ahead and forecast the future values. For this part, I guess I'll only explain it when I feel it's necessary, because we have done most of this in chapter 5. So for the standard calculations, I'll just fill up the cells. You should be able to understand the formulas. For this other income, because this is kind of a small number, also it doesn't really matter. It doesn't seem to be a big deal here. So I'm just going to set that to 0 going forward. Okay. So the profit before tax is the sum of everything above. So here we have the dividend growth rate, right? So so this is a little different from what we did in chapter 5, because we're assuming that the dividend is growing at a constant rate. So that's going to be equal to the previous dividend level times 1 plus the growth rate in dividend. So that's our retained earning for 2012. So to construct the balance sheet, we also need to make assumptions about the financing strategy going forward. Remember, they can either finance their growth internally, meaning using their own cash, or they can go out and issue more debt or issue more equity, things like that. Here, let me first demonstrate the internal financing approach, meaning they're going to finance with their own cash. Right? So they're not going to issue more debt or equity. In that case, I'm going to leave this one empty for now, and I'll come back to this. Let me make a note up here. So let's do pro forma internal financing, meaning they're growing using their own cash. So I'm going to leave this one empty and work on the other items in the balance sheet. So here the long-term receivables, I'm only going to model the part that is due to finance, right? Meaning this is for Caterpillar providing financing for their customers, right? For this other part, trade and other, I'm just going to assume that this is equal to, this is going to stay constant going forward. So I'm not saying for these items, assuming that they stay constant is necessarily the best thing to do, but without more information, this is really just a kind of a simplified approach. If you're actually a financial analyst analyzing a company, you probably should take these items more seriously and do some research into this, and probably also model the growth rate in these items. But here, because I don't have the information, and also they seem to be relatively small, so I'm just trying to keep things simple by assuming that they stay constant. Right? So for the financing part, it's going to be a ratio of the sales. So for all these other variables, I'm just going to assume that they will stay constant going forward. Again, this doesn't mean that this is the right thing to do. It's just a relatively simple thing to do. So you could probably model things like goodwill or intangible asset as also as a ratio of the sales, and that might make sense. But for now, I'm just trying to keep things simple. Again, because we're assuming that this is for internal financing, so debt and equity are staying the same as before. So here you have this liability for post-employment benefits. So that's basically the pension for their employees, for their retired employees, right? So that's, again, we can talk a little bit about this later because this is not really such a small item. It's pretty major. So for now, I'm going to assume that this one stays constant, but I'll come back to this point. So for now, let me assume that this item is going to stay constant over time. Other liability, I'm also going to assume it stays constant. Stock, we're not issuing more stocks, so the 6 accumulated earning is equal to B47 plus the retained earning. Again, treasury stock, remember that's for stock buyback. So I'm assuming that they're not going to buy back more stocks going forward. So this total stock buyback is going to stay constant. And all these other smaller items, I'm also going to assume that they will stay constant, okay, stay at their previous level. So now you balance out the balance sheet. And then finally, we back out the cash level. Minus everything else. Now we have our cash level in 2012. Okay. I can drag this for 4 more years. So that's going to be my forecast for the next 5 years. So in chapter 5, the next step would be to calculate the free cash flow. And also we can do valuation based on that. So let me copy these items over to my spreadsheet. So these two items are already given on top, so I'm going to delete those. So we're still using mid-year discounting. So that's our estimated equity value. So if you think about shares, the number of shares outstanding, if we go back to our ratios and then income statement, you see in their income statement they provide the most recent number of shares outstanding, so that's 645 million shares. So I'm going to copy that over. So that'll give you their share price. Okay, so now we have a pro forma model for Caterpillar. So I'm going to call this file pro forma save. So I can tell you that the actual share price of Caterpillar at the end of 2011 is around, actual price was around $95. Okay. It's been fluctuating, and it was fluctuating around this value back in 2011. So obviously our valuation seems to be fairly low compared to what the stock was trading at. Right? So let's see, to justify that kind of valuation, if I were to just do that by changing the long-term growth rate, see if I change the long-term growth rate to 10%, then the valuation would be that's a little too high. I guess 10% might be a little too high. So let's try maybe 9%. If I assume that Caterpillar was growing at 9%, that's too low. Okay, so it should be basically, to justify their valuation, the long-term growth rate in free cash flow is somewhere between 9 and 10%. Right? So if I say at 9.5%, that roughly matches the level where the stock was trading at. Right? So I mean, a 9% long-term growth rate seems to be a little too high to me. So it seems like the valuation based on this analysis was pretty rich back then. Of course, we need to discuss other, because we're making a lot of assumptions in terms, for example, the financing strategy going forward, and also the growth rate over the next 5 years, right? So we made all these assumptions. Maybe the financial analysts were making different assumptions about these back in 2011 or 2012. Right? But this is our template for analyzing the value of Caterpillar. So earlier I also mentioned that if you like, you can take a closer look at the pension. So here we're assuming that the pension is going to stay constant. This is basically the pension liability. It's going to stay constant. So if you look at the information in this ratios file in the balance sheet, okay. If you look at the balance sheet of Caterpillar, let's see, where is this pension? Yeah, I think that's the pension, right? So that's the pension of Caterpillar over the past 5 years, from 2007 to 2011, right? So you can see their pension has been growing, but it didn't really grow at a steady rate. You can see it at the beginning, it was 5,000 and then went all the way up to nearly 10,000, and then it went down and then went back up to 10,000. So it's kind of a bumpy growth. But over time, you can probably tell there's a little bit of growth. Let's see if I do insert, I do lines. I'm gonna put that in the cell here. If I were to plot the trend in pension, you can see over the time there's definitely a somewhat an upward trend, right? Even though it's not that smooth. So if you like to if you want to model this growth, that's fine. You can put this growth into your model. For example, I can do one simple thing I can do is maybe to say that so the 2011 level is F37 and the 2007 level is B37. Okay. And that's over 4 years. So if I divide that by 4, so maybe on average I can assume that their pension liability will grow by this dollar amount every year, right? So if I copy this number, suppose I want to model this, build this in my pro forma model, what I could do is say I can probably add another cell here called pension growth. So this is in dollar term, not in percentage term. And I can say that's equal to, I'm just gonna copy. So I'm gonna copy and paste numbers. Okay, it's gonna grow by this amount. Suppose I make this assumption, then here I can say that my pension is gonna grow by the previous level plus this new annual growth level. Okay. And I can enter, and I can drag that. So now you can see my pension is growing up. So that will change things a little bit. That's basically, okay, that's still a relatively small number, so it has barely much impact on the equity value. Right? So but that's just an example where you can make fine tunings to the model we made. So because we made some simple assumptions by assuming that these values will stay constant over time. These values will stay constant over time. You can model them as a with a growth rate or as a ratio of sales and so forth. Right? But here I'm not going to cover all the possibilities. We're only going to focus on modeling the major variables.